So let's start at the beginning. We're going to start with pattern language. You'll see that PL is short for pattern language. So permaculture, this definition was from Wiki, but I decided to change it because it said something about self-maintaining agricultural systems. And while that's a goal in permaculture, it's certainly not a reality. So I'd rather have my definitions reflect reality. So we'll just call these agricultural systems modeled on natural ecosystems. And permaculture, of course, is completely unregulated. It's just an area of inquiry that's caught on over the last 60 years, and people are very interested in it around the globe. And so it's had a lot to contribute to humanity over that time, and it continues to. What's interesting is that it remains unregulated, but because it has so much to offer, and it has so many good ideas, but it's not really organized yet. So I thought, well, why not present these ideas in somewhat of an organized way? Probably the best way is in a pattern language, because anyone who picks up on the patterns can interpret them in their own way, so that there's an infinite number of possibilities in terms of interpretation and in coordinating the different patterns that are assembled to do a project. So a pattern language then, you can read that, was initially developed by Christopher Alexander, and in terms of the built environment, and it really works with what we call patterns. We'll be talking a lot about those. Essentially what a pattern language helps us do is express the aliveness, the kind of innate aliveness and potential of a project. And what is this aliveness? What are we kind of aiming for in all of this work? He also calls it the quality that has no name, sort of like the core of the essence of something that's alive. It's sort of mystical, it's magical, and you can never really quite get there because it belongs to the infinite. And so that's where we want to go in terms of developing our patterns. You know you have a good pattern the close it gets to that quality without a name. And that's what I think keeps the pattern language alive itself. All right, so here's the volume 2 of the pattern language set. The first volume is the timeless way of building. And if you're interested in pattern language, this is certainly prerequisite necessary reading. What's interesting about Christopher Alexander is that it took him about 20 years to put these volumes together, and about 20 people a year. So that's about 400 person years that went into this. And he is known as an architect, but he was also a mathematician and a physicist before he became an architect. And so he brings a lot of discipline to this study. But it almost focuses entirely on the built environment. So he looked at towns, regions in which towns were organized, communities, neighborhoods, clusters of buildings, the streets, the spaces between buildings. So it was all about the built environment. And so we think then that while this was a magnificent work, it really didn't draw very much on the environment and how to live in an environmental age, and as we move forward into an environmental age. So this is what drew some interest then in creating a pattern language for today, stemming from Christopher Alexander's work. So essentially what's driving this interest then is to organize a pattern language for today's needs, and not to intrude into Christopher Alexander's work, but to stand beside it, sort of as a sister pattern language. The idea also is to use the internet so that the development of this pattern language could be available for everyone to participate. Sort of like Wiki is available for anyone to add their expertise into. It would be interesting to offer this through the internet so that people could add their own patterns. So as we get into this language, we have to start with some sort of groupings of topics. So essentially then, the topics that we're willing to work with are those that Holmgren reminds us of in permaculture, which is land care, people care, and fair share. And so I've listed some of the major categories within those three here. And you'll often find these categories in other sorts of environmental design systems. So this really isn't much new, except we are sort of evolving into the blue headings now. So we're beginning to recognize the value of indigenous peoples, and we're recognizing social organization and this lovely pattern that I'd like to speak more on, cultural emergence, which is sort of the evolution of our culture from the post-industrial age and the age of dualism into the age of potential, into the age of recognizing that we have to live within our limits in the global environment, and what that means in terms of culture. And of course, fair share is associated with economics. So in order to set the scope for this endeavor, there were some decisions that had to be made. We thought that should we stay strictly within permaculture, sort of just within the permaculture literature and sort of just work with that? Or should we sort of spread out a little bit and see what sort of patterns, what sort of principles are shared within the larger environmental design community? Or indeed, should we just open up the floodgates entirely, and should we just accept all environmental design systems and make a grand sustainability pattern language? Well, it's a big enough endeavor just to do permaculture. So we decided then that we should stay within permaculture, but to admit other imported related principles and patterns that are related with permaculture to the other environmental design systems and how other environmental design systems influence permaculture. So we're willing to go kind of blur the boundaries a little bit, but basically stay within permaculture. So just to compare, we could take, I forgot to mention that we will be taking a break and taking questions at the end, unless the questions are very brief.
When you're saying permaculture, are you including humans' habitation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we're including the built environment, but we don't want to duplicate what Alexander has done.
Okay, I just wasn't sure what
Yeah.
your definition for how.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it has to include.
Culture or
Yeah, it includes both. And that involves necessarily the built environment. So to compare the two and to see how we're sort of evolving from one to the other, we can look at some of these. If we look at, let's say, housing clusters and work communities, that's definitely a solid pattern in Christopher Alexander's work. On the other side, though, we're beginning to look at new urbanism and the usefulness of eco-villages. So we're kind of bringing an environmental focus to things like housing clusters and calling those eco-villages. Down here we're looking at housing clusters and communities of common land. And so that's great. We have common land there and the common use of land. Environmentally, we can be looking at local food, fiber, and fuel production. So that's definitely an environmental focus. Local shops and gathering places. We can also then start to look at community farms and farmers' markets. So this is starting to tell us a bit more about how we can interpret these old patterns in an environmental way and come up with new patterns. Building inside and outside the edge interface. We're also looking at the interface and with things like solar orientation, because Christopher Alexander doesn't really associate too much with things like solar orientation. So that's how we're sort of moving, sort of evolving out of Christopher Alexander's work. I also want to spend a little bit more time then comparing the patterns from one language to another. Alexander talks about site repair, but in that context, site repair is just not building on green fields if you have the option to build on a brown field. So he's saying, don't build in a beautiful place, save that beautiful place for later, and just build in a place that's already been disturbed. But now when we talk about site repair, we have to actually step back, like all the way to a global level. So we can talk about global repair and regional repair, and even subdivision repair. Existing subdivisions can be redesigned into more sustainable communities. So that's a form of site repair that's definitely new and interesting. And minimal site disturbance. So we're just saying, you know, if you're going to develop a new site, keep the topsoil, look at the drainage, kind of work with the drainage of the site without changing it too much. Keep the site alive, you know, keep it breathing, basically. And disturb it as least as possible. He does have compost. His idea of compost, of course, is with human recycling of wastes, human manure. And that's as far as he gets into compost. Well, naturally, we can look at compost in terms of nutrient recycling with all the nutrient substances we're in touch with, and recycle garden compost. And we can add mulch to that pattern as well. Farmhouse kitchen. He talks about the size of a kitchen being large enough to have a big group of people around and have a heavy table. And that's really important. We're looking at that now in terms of family table. What does that mean in terms of having a family table in the environmental age? And how does that bring other people together in an extended family? So we're kind of bringing in the social organization aspect into these patterns as well. This is an example. These are just examples of how we're kind of evolving out of Christopher Alexander's work. And a couple more, because we wanted to look at this. Efficient structure. When he talks about efficient, he's talking about how to make the largest building with the least amount of material. And so that's kind of material efficiency. But of course today, efficiency means energy efficiency. So he's talking about green buildings, and we're talking about green buildings now, and how to make them the most energy efficient. So that must be an emerging pattern in today's world that wasn't so important in Christopher Alexander's time. And you can read through these. He has another one called fruit trees, and that's just a great idea for having fruit trees outside your door, basically in the neighborhood somewhere. But we can develop more extensive patterns around fruit production than that. in terms of polyculture orchards, in terms of community orchards, and growing a lot of different plant materials in the same place, with an orchard, with the orchard being the dominant structure. He does mention greenhouses, but there's many other types of greenhouses that aren't mentioned in that language. So we can talk about season extension and bioshelters, and sort of indoor-outdoor rooms and solariums and all those things that haven't been mentioned yet. So I hope this gives you an idea about if there's a need to move from one language to another. So that ends our first TED Bite on rationale and scope.